maybe just me. These are from Ofsted's own slides, and talks here about the piece of research that was done back in '95 in the States. It had been disputed that some of the findings here, but generally the general findings here, which highlight that experience of vocabulary from birth to starting school, and the difference between children in professional families, working class families, and families receiving welfare in the States, does resonate in general terms. It's not always as cut and dried as that. There are some children from professional families who don't, they're passed from pillar to post. The childminder picks them up in the morning, drops them at school for breakfast club. After school, they go back to the childminder. Do they have high quality interactions, vocabulary development? But in general terms, when we talk about some of our disadvantaged pupils, and you'll know better than me because you're dealing with it, but I know secondhand from visiting lots of schools, a number of early years colleagues who are saying children are coming in quite often lower and lower in terms of communication, language, more and more non-verbal children, even to the extent of just not having developed the musculature to articulate certain sounds, let alone speak proper in it. So it's a key priority for a lot of schools, but not just on entry into early years, but on through the school, depending on context. And still the legacy of the COVID cohorts coming through. So yeah, I've worked with schools where, yes, this kind of thing, they go, yeah, that's our school. Lots of children, very low in terms of vocabulary. We have to focus so much on language development from entry, but all the way through the school. And you go into their early years and it's very evident. There are the adults who benefit from the training, perhaps from the speech and language therapist who's disseminated some strategies. And you can see that over time of certain adults working with those non-verbal children with those exercises to develop the musculature to articulate sounds. With other adults, they are quite demanding of the more articulate children. So that in a nice way, but demanding that the children do respond in full sentences or phrases, and not accepting a one-word answer or a grunt from a child who they know could be more articulate, who are adults who are making reference to certain subject-specific vocabulary around the correct names for certain animals in the small world when the children are sorting farm animals and African animals, whatever they're up to. Yeah, it's those settings where you actually see that in practice. And I look at the reading corner, I think I'd like to read a book in there. And evidently so do those children, not just when an adult's reading with them, but when they can choose and you see them reading to each other, sharing the books, you just think, yeah, they're working on vocabulary. The head's told me it's an issue. I can see what they're doing about it. Then you go outside and see it in the outdoor area. And there's opportunities for vocabulary development as well. It sits very comfortably with what the head has said the issues are. Great. And then how does that continue up into Key Stage 1? But similarly, I've been into schools where that is apparently the issue, and you go into early years and you think, I don't see specifically what they're doing to address that. I've just heard adults speak on behalf of the children. One springs to mind of, it was snack time, and it was later on in the year, wasn't first back in September, it was later on in the school, it was last year, later on in the year. And the children were very passive. They sat in a circle while the adults brought the fruit around. So just those social skills of the children going and getting the fruit themselves and making a choice or asking for it. And the adults were answering for the children. What would you like? Would you like the apple or would you like the carrot? You'd like the carrots, would you? And he said, let them speak to you. Let them ask and model that for them and get them to ask you. That sense of frustration that we've all felt when we're watching practice that isn't that strong and you really want to step in and go for few and far between, but I saw it last year. So this comes back to what you're saying in your self-evaluation about context. Therefore, what are we doing about it? If the children are coming in and they are articulate and they have benefited from a wide-ranging vocabulary, then obviously you're off to stronger starting points, and therefore, what are you doing to make the most of that? And this was based on Stanovich's work back in '93, Does Reading Make You Smarter?, where it was making the link between vocabulary and reading. And we know that reading is so important anyway, but also this course is about inspection. Ofsted, you will get a deep dive in reading, particularly early reading. And it's this kind of vocabulary that resulted in Ofsted focusing so much on reading as the key to accessing the curriculum. 90% of vocabulary only really encountered in reading. And it makes sense. The children aren't going to be using the language of a river system and the formation of Oxbow Lake, let's go for the geography classic, in their everyday conversations with their carers, adults, or on the school playing field. And the point there about fiction, although Stanovich was looking at it from a secondary perspective, and that was shared with Ofsted because they are quite secondary, Ofsted in many ways, I would say equally true to the primary curriculum. If we keep the geography example, the children might come across the word estuary in a story. Might be an adventure story that the class teacher is reading to the class, and the heroes have arrived at an estuary and they're being pursued. Oh my gosh, how are they going to get across? Oh, they find a boat. Thank goodness for that. And they escape in the boat just in time. And they row and paddle themselves across the estuary. Now, as a listener or as a reader to that story, I can work out, in that case, an estuary is something big and wet, because I didn't know what it was, but they got in a boat and they're rowing across it. So lake, big pond, it's a bit like that. Yeah? But it doesn't teach me the precise definition of an estuary as part of a river system, and it's the bit where it enters the sea. It's that precision that is missing if a child's diet is predominantly fiction, and lots of other vocabulary they won't encounter. And lots of schools have done a considerable amount of work around the quality of the fiction texts that the children are exposed to. Very common in schools now to have the spine of text through the school that every child will have read to them or will read as they progress through the school. And that's great. And there are lists out there. Pi Corbett's done one. All of those, and schools adapt them or have done that, and that's brilliant. But in some schools, there hasn't been the same rigor to the non-fiction. Not all, but in some. You can have a school where there is a real precision and thought given to the fiction. There's our classic text in Key Stage 2, Swallows and Amazons. And there's the classic poem, The Highwayman, or The Night Mail. Night Train, isn't it? But then you go into that school and Key Stage 2 class are learning about the vicious Vikings. And any book with Vikings in the title or on the cover has been put on that little display in the corner. And when you look, some of them aren't really age appropriate. Some of them, this is year 5. That's a bit easy, isn't it? Or that's a bit difficult. That looks more like a Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 4 book. This one's so out of date. They've still got horns on their helmets. But it doesn't matter because it's got Vikings on the cover. And actually, by the end of term, you could do the Hotel Inspector white glove test. A nice layer of dust off, though. It's made the display look nice and it's celebrated books. But have the children actually read any of those books, other than the 3 children who were quite interested in Vikings and asked if they could take a book home? Have any of those books been used explicitly in teaching as source material for the children to find 2 different accounts of the Vikings and Lindisfarne? Look at it and how have 2 different historians written about it? Do their both accounts match? Why not? What are the similarities? How do we write as a historian? Let's read and find out. It's that, don't forget the non-fiction as well as the fiction. And how are the children going to learn the academic vocabulary? If it's just a word bank of here are our 10 or 12 keywords about the Romans, and it's been stuck on the wall, that's not going to do it. The children aren't going to absorb it by osmosis. All the research suggests for a new word or phrase to become part of a child's lexicon, and that long-term memory, they need to be exposed to it a minimum of 10 times. And that doesn't mean a teacher who's teaching about ancient Rome can say, right, today, children, centurion, 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 centurion. Tomorrow, Colosseum. So I'm doing this alphabetically. No, of course not. The children need to use that language in their verbal responses to questions, perhaps in some written work. I was in a school where keywords and phrases for a unit in history were displayed on a board, but there was lots of space around them. It wasn't just a list. And the children had access to post-it notes, quite large post-it notes. And they could write their own sentences that included that word or phrase. Or if they were reading a book, doing some research, or looking on a website to find out more about It was the Romans, actually. And they found a sentence with that word in, or a fact, a definition of that word. They could copy it on, go and get a post-it note, copy it out and stick it around that word, so it became covered in that language in different contexts. So the children could refer to it, and I saw a teacher in a class where they were doing this. It was a different subject, but they still, same principle. And the children finished a lesson, were lined up for assembly, and they had a minute or two because they tied it up very promptly. And the teacher said, right, before we go down to assembly, everyone close your eyes. And he pulled one of the post-it notes off the board and played blankety blank with the children. He read the sentence out, but blanked the key word, blank, right, which of our key words was missing there? Which do you think it was? Can anyone remember without looking at the board? Some of you, okay, have a look at the board if that's going to help you. But which of our key words was it? Why was it that particular word? How do you know? Can anyone give me another sentence with our key word in? What? Everyone tell me what it means again? So just reinforcing and reiterating that key vocabulary. But just be careful when you're talking with an inspector about, oh yeah, love of reading. Yeah, we do loads of that. We've promoted this, we've promoted that around the school. But what about the non-fiction as well as the fiction? One of the schools I worked with had introduced story time at the end of the day, right across the primary, right across the school, because in that school's context, the children didn't read at home, weren't read to, there weren't any books in the houses. And it was lovely. And it provided that experience for the children. But by calling it story time, every teacher was reading fiction. And they changed it to reading time, which gave me the choice as a class teacher to not always, and I did a bit of quick staff meeting about this, or a session in a staff meeting, and just said, don't always read fiction. So as a key stage 1 or early years teacher, I might be reading pretty much a book a night, particularly in year 1. So sometimes I might read an extract from a different book. It might be something about Florence Nightingale, like a biography of Florence Nightingale, or something about the Great Fire of London, or it might be something about some animals that we've been learning about when we've been looking at animals that live in hot and cold countries in early years, and then saying to the children, and it's from this book, and I'm going to put it in our reading area if anyone wants to read it tomorrow. And similarly in Key Stage 2, we're not going to have the next chapter. Yes, I know it was a cliffhanger, and we want to see what's going to happen, but today I'm going to read you this, and it might be a news report about something linked with the geography at the moment, or the biography of a sports person or a dancer that links with our PE, or the instructions for activity, or something that's in the world of engineering that I can make a link with what we're doing in design technology at the moment. And I saw it on our website. I've put the link on our class page if you want to find out more. But just so the children don't always have fiction read at them. Because for some children, if we're developing a love of reading, fiction isn't going to do it. Think of you might think I never get a chance to read. Chance to be a fine thing. Think back to the summer holidays when you try to actually have time in the year to read a book. Not all of us as adults like fiction. One of my friends is an avid reader, but he doesn't read fiction. He reads biographies of obscure musicians and indie bands from the 1980s and 90s. Anything about that, he's all over that. He doesn't read fiction. And it's going to be the same for some of the children in school. So from that piece of research, there's lots that comes from that. And it's making sure when you say to Ofsted, oh yes, yeah, reading. What about the non-fiction as well as the fiction? It makes me smile when I go around schools. It's not so much a thing now, but a couple of years ago, lots of schools, teachers were putting on their classroom door a picture of themselves reading a book, what Mrs. Smith is reading at the moment. Sometimes it was their favourite book from when they were a child, so there they were reading Stick of the Dump or Very Hungry Caterpillar, but quite often it's what are they reading at the moment. And so it did make me smile when it was quite highbrow stuff. Some teachers had themselves reading the third Charles Dickens of the year, one of the big thick ones, and so the teacher next door thought, oh, right, they're reading Dostoevsky in the original Russian. Are you really? Because I've been a teacher and it's got more difficult since I was in the classroom. I don't think they'd have the mental capacity or energy to read Dostoevsky or Dickens. I think if that was a real snapshot of what teachers are actually reading, if they had any time to read, it's probably going to be more likely Take a Break or maybe 50 Shades, or don't take a photo of that and stick it on my classroom door. So you get that sort of thing around the school, but how often is it non-fiction? So yeah, made my point. And then another training slide here, looking at the link with reading and knowledge and making sure children actually understand what they read. We've all taught the child whose parent sees us at the end of the day because they finished that book, they've read that book. Can they have the next one, please? Is think, yes, they might have read it in inverted commas. They didn't understand a word of it, and they barked at the print. That comprehension and that knowledge of what they've read. But what we need to do as teachers is make sure that we focus the children in on the key knowledge. What are we learning in this unit in art and design about this artist, about this type of this particular media we're using? What skills are we learning when we apply that knowledge? And then can we apply that when we are decorating whatever we've made in design technology? Can we make reference to some of that art knowledge? Or when we're learning about ancient Egypt in history, can we also use our geographical knowledge to identify where Egypt is on that map? And find the river that runs through it and talk about which direction the River Nile runs into and what sea does it run into? What's it called? Where an estuary. Yeah, we learned about that, didn't we? Right, now back to the history. So we don't want things to get muddled up into cross-curricular soup, my phrase, which you sometimes used to get with the topic or thematic approach, where things got too mixed up and you couldn't actually tell, you lost that fidelity to the key subjects, actual subjects. But we should be making explicit the cross-curricular links across the curriculum. So, for example, the children can identify Egypt when they learn about ancient Egypt. They can show you on a map where the Roman Empire extended to if they've learned about the Roman Empire, about geography, history, crossover, for example. And whereas in the old days, I remember years ago, progress from an Ofsted perspective was data-driven. It was English maths. What's your progress like through Key Stage 2? How many points of progress have the children made? I'm showing my age here. And now, yes, the data is the starting point, and we'll talk about that this afternoon when I talk about impact and IDSR being the starting point for inspection. And of course, progress is important in terms of what the data says. But beyond that, it's looking at your curriculum and your curriculum intent. What knowledge have you chosen in your curriculum for the children to acquire and learn in this unit? And how does that cumulatively build to the children meeting the end of key stage expectations? What vocabulary are the children learning at the moment in this unit about Great Fire of London, or this unit about Judaism? Not that Ofsted do many deep dives in RE, but what events, people, places are the children learning about in history or geography? What are the concepts and procedures the children are learning in this science unit, in maths, in design and technology? So that links back to the decisions you've made as a school around your intent. What key knowledge are the children learning, rather than trying to learn everything there is to learn about the Romans? What have you decided is most important for the children to learn? How are you honing that down into what did the Romans ever do for us? Or how do we know that our town was originally a Roman settlement? What key knowledge do the children need? And Ofsted will make reference to what is around them. I was basically sat where that photo is taken from, talking with some children, and I could see, obviously, this is what they had learned. It was towards the end of the unit. So I asked them about it. It was nice to see a computing display other than online safety. I know computing doesn't lend itself to display because lots of the children's work is just saved online or in their folders. But in this instance, because the school had done some work on developing writing, they had done a written evaluation of their app that they had made in computing, together with those screenshots to show the final product. And obviously, there's the key vocabulary associated with making that app and using that bit of software. So I could, I didn't have to pretend ignorant. I was ignorant of that particular bit of software, as I am of many things. So I said to the children, so did you, what were you learning here? Can you explain this to me? How does that work? I haven't seen this software. So what did your app do and what was it about? And they were all over it. They told me all sorts of things. And I said, so I can see the word text up there. When I see that, I think of text on my phone or the text we look at in an English lesson. Oh no, and they could tell me what those words and phrases meant in relation to that app and the software they used. And it's stood up to scrutiny. They obviously knew and explained it to me. A lot of it was, but it evidently showed they knew it, and they could tell me what they had learnt and other software they'd used. So that's a very Ofsted-y thing to do. I was in the school doing whatever it is I do in schools. I wasn't inspecting in this instance, but it stood up to that conversation. And this example in another school where in Key Stage 1, they had these displays and they were pretty consistent. They'd changed their maths working rules to have the square background so that teachers could model one digit or one symbol per square, as they expected the children to in the books. And there was consistency between the classrooms. There was key vocabulary. I know it's not that clear, but in the middle there, you've got the key vocabulary, add, more than, equals. And that was relevant to what was being taught at the moment. I saw teachers or adults make reference to that to certain children, reminding children about the digit formation in the bottom centre there. It was useful and purposeful, and it matched the current learning, and children were referencing it. And yeah, great. And the school had said, oh, we've done lots of work on this because previously it was very different in different classrooms, and some teachers weren't really using it as a teaching aid or something to help the children remember or to model things. It just had the twinkle sprinkle plastered over it. Other classrooms were using it. So they had done a lot of work on actually what's going to be most useful for our children. What does it mean in our school? I'm not saying it's the only way to do things, but I'd been primed by the head that they had done work on this. And when I went into the classroom, thought, oh yeah, I can see that. Very purposeful. And you said you did. And I went to the classroom next door and it was pretty much identical, slightly different, but definitely it had that school's way of doing things. And then we went up to Key Stage 2 and saw how that developed. And there was that consistency through a developmental consistency through the school. All of them had the square background so that could be modelled because they'd had an issue in the past with presentation in books. So that helped with that as well, setting the expectation. And I've put these examples here. It's two different schools because geography has been identified in Ofsted's research review as the poor relation compared with history. The school on the left had identified that anyway in their own school. Through their pupil voice that they had carried out, a lot of the children were very clear on what history was as a subject. They could explain it was learning about the old days, learning about the past, and they could also talk about what they had learnt in history, and they were developing a sense of chronology, could talk about when events happened and put them in chronological order. They still had some work to do on it, but it was not too bad. The feedback from their own monitoring in geography had really made them go, whoa, because a lot of the children said, what's geography, what? And we don't do it. Now, leaders felt they did, and teachers said, oh, we do. But when they looked in the books, there was far more history than geography. There was far more structure in the work the children producing, which reflected the planned progression. Geography was a bit more scattergun, a little bit more dependent on worksheets. Had they done geography or had they done colouring in? There was a bit of that. And by their own admission, a lot of the teachers felt less confident in teaching geography, which is what the research review found. The national curriculum doesn't help non-specialists when you compare history with geography, because history is far more prescriptive. It tells us the periods in history to teach, or at least suggests the periods in history we can teach. It gives us examples of specific people we could teach the children about. So it gives us a structure, whereas geography just says, here's a whole load of geography, teach it. And here's a load more in Key Stage 2, teach that as well. It doesn't give us a vehicle for it necessarily. So unless you're a geographer, it can lack that precision. So that was the school's response. That's one of the main corridors. And this was to re-establish geography within the school. There's a little reading area beneath that with some nice chairs, and they put some geography books there, and children could sit down and read those. And on the right-hand side was a bookshelf, and they put examples of geographical books from each year group on there. And it was coupled with sort of a relaunch of geography. There was some teacher training around their own subject knowledge. They went back to the planning and tweaked a few things, tightened it up, and made it explicit to the children, you are geographers. In this lesson, we are being geographers. This is what geography is all about. Thought of few resources and so on. But it was all part of a relaunch after they had done their own monitoring and found those issues. And then on the right there, that was a Year 5 classroom where they had a bit of space. Yeah, I know, but they did actually have a bit of space in the Key Stage 2 classroom. Very similar background. Geography, they realised, had been weaker compared with history and science. And so in that unit about rivers, that Ordnance Survey map has got the school on it somewhere and the town where the school is. And the children were fascinated with that, and it lent itself to promoting geography. And the children had activities through that unit to find the rivers and the water systems on that map and think about, oh, yeah, I've been there. Or they did a field trip from one of them, found it on the map. And then they had activities to plan routes from the school to another place on the map. How would you get there? What different routes could you take? Loads of mapping skills. Again, it raised the prominence of geography, which as a geographer myself was a good thing, but also it's the kind of thing that if these schools were inspected, it's being able to articulate the story behind this to an inspector, to put into context the little snapshot that they're coming into the school for 2 days, well, a day and 2/3 before they disappear to gather their thoughts, and being able to say, oh, you will see out there, and the reason for that display is it's a response to our plate spinning in school and what we've identified we need to do. And then, of course, Ofsted will ask the children, so what's geography? And I know there's an inevitability that when Ofsted speak with a child, they gravitate to that child who, despite all the work that school's done about geography, the first child the inspector will go, what's geography? I don't do that. Now, some teachers seem a bit mystified that the inspector went straight to that child in their class or that child in the playground, as if it's some magical power inspector. Of course it's not. It's just we can all spot them. All inspectors have been teachers. It might have been in the dim and distant past, but we can all, as teachers, spot that child. It's a survival strategy. We wouldn't have survived as teachers if we couldn't identify those children very, very quickly. That's what inspectors do. But the other thing is, teachers give it away. So a top tip for your teachers, when Ofsted do a learning walk and come into their classroom. Now, I'll do a joint learning walk with a head if I'm working in their school. We go into a classroom and I would be sneaking in the middle of a lesson, sneaking quietly, and I will just make eye contact with the teacher, just out of courtesy, really, because it's pretty daunting. This bloke's coming in. What's he looking for? So I just go, quick eye contact, quick, don't mind the kind of, and I just watch their eyes, because they'll look at you and go, and then their eyes just flit, just to check that child, just to check he's sitting where he should be checking and he hasn't stuck his pencil up his nose. They can't help it, just to check. And I just watch. Who do they look at? Oh, it's him, is it? Thanks very much. So there's a top tip for your teachers. Next time someone comes in with a clipboard or whatever, just trust he's doing what he should be doing and he's not sticking a pencil up his nose. Just guide with your eyes. Just look at that other child instead. That child who knows everything about the unit you're teaching, who can remember what they learned in reception. Just go, hi, God, please talk to her. Please talk to her. So there you go, top tip for your teachers. But it's being able to put together the pieces in your school. This could be that initial tour when you take an inspector around when they arrive. You could say, oh, the geography display here, that's our response to some monitoring. I'm sure my geography lead will be able to explain that to you later when you meet with them as part of the deep dive. But it's a whole school push. We're far better at it now. We identified that. Oh, that table over there. Oh, that's the mapping skills. That's our response to, and we find it's been really useful with the children. They've been really engaged. They love a map. We point these things out to an inspector and the reason for it. And don't forget, again, I've used geography as an example because I say it's supposedly my subject back in the dim and distant past. It was easier when I was at uni because half of it hadn't been discovered then. Most of it just said, here be dragons. But that's just my age. They don't expect, when they speak with a class teacher, if it was a geography deep dive, they wouldn't expect a class teacher to be able to talk about the precision of the specific types of knowledge that were taught in that lesson. but they might discuss with the geography subject lead, did they read the research report? What were the implications? And the key thing in a lot of subjects is the disciplinary knowledge. Lots of schools, for example, in history and geography, and to an extent science, have made it very clear in their curriculum intent what the substantive knowledge is. What will the children learn about Kenya, or about the Great Fire of London, or about magnets? But the actual disciplinary knowledge of how would a geographer present this information? How would a historian write this report? What questions would a scientist ask? That's the bit that's often missing, the disciplinary knowledge of being a geographer, being a scientist, being a computerist. So just be mindful of that one, and make sure your subject leaders can show what does that look like. Is there a precision to that? And you might have seen in the report and the review, in geography, it's the field work that is often missing. Of the substantive knowledge, lots of locational knowledge, learning about locations, strangely enough, and being able to connect that. One thing I've recommended to the schools I've worked with, on any map, if the school is on there, put an arrow saying, you are here. You know, like when you go to a big shopping centre or something and it has the map of it and it's always got the, you are here. Or when you go to a tourist town or village or somewhere and it has the map to help you find your way around, there's always got the, you are here. I suggest that to schools. Map of the world, you are here. Map of this country, you are here. Because children just don't know it. We assume children know this kind of thing, and they often don't. It doesn't help that words like county, country, and continent all sound very similar. But the number of children who I've asked in school on my travels, where am I? I don't know. I mean, they'll tell me, oh, you're at St Winfrid's Primary School. I say, what county is this? You show me on the map over there where we are. Okay, well, that's Iceland, but yeah, fieldwork is something that schools need to just be mindful of. And disciplinary knowledge in any subject. I've used this from the research review as an example. And then this one's from computing. It doesn't, they really haven't helped themselves, Ofsted, with these research reviews, because they are obviously subject specific. And that's fine for secondary colleagues who are only teaching one, possibly two subjects, but they have a main subject. If I'm a computing teacher in secondary, I've just got to get head around this kind of stuff, the declarative and procedural knowledge. But the different reviews have different definitions of knowledge. Some have two forms of knowledge, some have three. For a generalist primary teacher, you can't get your heads around all of that. But it is useful for the subject leaders just to have reflected on this and think, oh yeah, oh, okay, so that's, yeah, we've got that in our curriculum here and here. Oh, hang on a minute, do we do that? Clarity for knowledge of computer science, what does that look like? Let's look at the purple mash planning and just have a, yeah, oh, I see what you mean now. That kind of just getting their heads around what this means in relation to whatever curriculum you have is a useful exercise. But they won't, as computing subject leader in a primary school, be grilled on this. Not allowed to look at it. Give me an example of declarative digital literacy. What? No, they won't ask that, but they will expect subject leaders to have reflected on the documentation that's available and used it to perhaps identify any gaps in the curriculum, perhaps to inform a trail and their own monitoring. Because as a subject leader, I don't know what that looks like. Right, I'm going to go and look for that. Yeah, fair enough. And that's why it's in my action plan. And this is what I was saying about a lot of schools have worked on substantive knowledge, what the children will learn about Mary Seacole or what the Romans ever did for us, but it's the being a historian, being a geographer, that sometimes isn't as progressive. And Ofsted have found examples of it actually goes backwards, where perhaps in a Key Stage 2 class in year 3 or 4, the children had written a viewpoint of a historical event from two different viewpoints. You know, that's writing as a historian. It's not always cut and dried. What would, for one person's invader, is another person's hero who's gone off to find new lands for us. So they've written it from two different perspectives, and then they get to the year above and they go back to just looking at it in some very simplistic terms. You think, hang on a minute, no, they can already see it from two different viewpoints. Why have you gone backwards? And examples of disciplinary knowledge where it's been highly problematic were shared on Ofsted training. One of the examples was where children had written an account of the Vikings attacking Lindisfarne, and they'd written it as a newspaper article. And the marking and feedback was all about how newspapery it was. Little comments praising the children for their alliterative headline, Fisher's Vikings, and their use of subheadings, and the fact they'd started it with a rhetorical question to grab the reader. And actually, in some of those articles, the historical knowledge was inaccurate, and that hadn't been picked up. A little code for where errors were made, and it wasn't. It was all about the secretarial, the spelling, or praising them for exciting vocabulary. So basically, the teacher's focus had been on writing for obvious reasons. But when inspectors, when they were in that school, asked some of the children about their historical knowledge, some of the children thought that there were newspapers at that time. Why wouldn't you? You know, the teachers told us to write newspapers that the monks could read to find out about. And that's evidently wrong. And also, historians would not write that as a newspaper article. Historians would write it as a chronological report, or as looking at it from two different perspectives, looking at it from comparing the sources from the time and looking at some of the language that was in the contemporary sources. I think one of the sources says something like dragons were seen flying in the firmament in one of the historic, at the time that was written, one of the monks had written an account of the Vikings attacking and exploring, were there really dragons then? Why do you think one of the monks in one of the contemporary accounts, it talked about dragons in the firmament? Well, first of all, what the heck's the firmament? Let's find out. And then perhaps some of the children thinking, of course, dragons weren't, but do you think they were making, it might be, wasn't it? What have we seen about the Viking boats? Right. So why do you think the monks might have mentioned dragons? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's being a historian, not writing a pseudo newspaper report and all of that. So it's that precision of being geographers, being historians, being scientists. And historically, there has been a little bit of writing being the priority. Let's write a newspaper report about the Vikings. Let's write a poem about the river system. No, let's write it as a geographer or as a scientist.